Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on the crypto crime investigation. So this is the first of the series. Today we have an amazing, we're joined by an amazing panel. So we have Aidan Larkin, CEO and co-founder of Asset Reality. Hi, Aidan. We have Matthew Laidland, director at Digital Asset Redemption, and Roman Bieda, head of fraud investigation at Coinfirm. So we're going to start with money laundering. Like a lot to discuss in this topic. We're going to move then to ransomware and sanctions exposure, and we're going to finish off with asset recovery. So at the end of the webinar, we're going to have 10-15 minutes for questions. So you can write your questions straight away, and we're going to address them at the end of the webinar. If you have any trouble with the webinar itself, with like any technical issues, please close the webinar and rejoin on the same link, so it should work fine. All right, let's start with introducing self-intro from our guests, and we're going to start with Aidan.
Thanks very much, Stas, for the opportunity to join this webinar today. As you mentioned, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Asset Reality. I'm a former criminal investigator and cryptocurrency investigator. And in Asset Reality, we build out solutions to make crypto safer. So from assisting victims in initial hacks through to managing seized crypto on behalf of government agencies. So I'm coming here today from a very sort of practical application and use case, and I'm also a lecturer and UN consultant on seized assets.
Perfect. Okay, we're moving to Matthew from Digital Asset Redemption.
Thanks, Stas, and thanks to Coinfirm for putting this together. My name is Matt Laidline. I'm managing director at Digital Asset Redemption, which is a business in the cybersecurity industry that helps companies who are affected by ransomware and other cyber extortion events manage cryptocurrency transactions and the compliance systems around those when a decision has been made to make a payment to a criminal entity, a threat actor, or someone unknown who is holding their data for hostage.
Great, thank you, Matt. And we move to Roman Bieda, head of fraud investigation at Coinfirm. Roman, if you can tell a bit more about what you do.
Thank you, Stas. So I'm head of fraud investigations at Coinfirm, where we create unique on the world scale crypto asset tracking solutions that enable both successful crypto asset tracking, but also recovery. For the past few years, we've traced hundreds of crypto cases, some of them the biggest out there in crypto history, for example, Quadriga case.
Thank you, Roman. Right, so basically, just to start with some setup, we're gonna start with the definition of money laundering, and I'll ask Aidan to start, and then you guys can jump in with your thoughts on this.
Certainly, from my point of view, I think from crypto crime and sort of crimes involving cryptocurrency, when we think about money laundering, it's important not to sort of go into sort of the granular detail. I mean, any movement of illicit funds, any movement, whether it's tax evasion through to crypto hacks, it all falls under this sort of money laundering umbrella. So from our lens at Asset Reality, we're really interested in identifying when victims first report the crypto fraud, I mean, where those assets are sent to, and how we can try and track and trace them using the tools that are available, and ultimately then lead to a successful recovery position. But all around the world, different governments are tackling crimes involving crypto, and the money laundering is that overarching sort of law and catch-all that allows them to freeze assets and sort of chase down people involved in cryptocurrency crime.
Thank you. Matt, anything to add?
We always confront an issue where we know that there's going to be money laundering at some point after the transaction that we conduct. And so understanding how our responsibility to monitor those transactions fit within different government regulations, as Aidan observed, is a huge challenge for any type of asset. And I think that we're lucky to be in the cryptocurrency space where we get to observe a distributed ledger that keeps track of where every movement that these coins that we send out take after we send them. There's a tremendous amount of intelligence to be learned from that about who these criminal entities that we work with might be, where they're located, and harvesting that information is a challenge for us, a challenge for law enforcement, and a challenge for the companies that we help.
Okay, Roman?
Well, I may only agree with Matt. So before we started, we discussed that in blockchain it is extraordinary because the guy sitting at home in front of the computer can trace billions of dollars on blockchain without any special equipment. So yeah. That's a huge advantage, and but also blockchain brings some challenges not known in traditional financial markets. So I'm pretty sure we'll discuss that further.
Okay, and so my next question is: so assuming that obviously the crypto market is growing, does the quantity, like the number of assets which are laundered, are they growing as well? Like have we seen increase into 2021? Are we going to see bigger increase in 2022? Matt?
Well, we sit in a spot where we observe that this kind of cybercrime is increasing almost exponentially. It's fairly easy for criminals to enter this space. They need to find access into someone's system and perpetrate a ransomware attack or some other type of cyber extortion. And so as people get more proficient at that, these attacks are increasing on a daily basis. More than that, however, we see that there's a lot more different types of crime that are possible. Aidan will talk about, I'm sure, the number of exchanges that have been hacked for different kinds of crypto assets and how they move afterwards. There's all sorts of new vehicles. NFTs, I think last year, were a very popular thing for retail investors, and they were a very popular thing for cyber criminals. And so we're only starting to scratch the surface of our understanding of how these new crypto assets can operate in, let's say, a black market or criminal economy.
Thank you, Matt. Aidan, what could you add to this?
Yeah, I would sort of pick up on what Matt had mentioned, is that when we see all of these different vectors and sort of the prediction for 2022 and sort of in the theme of this webinar is that what can we expect coming down the line? And I think that we did have this perfect storm in 2019 and 2020 and 21, where with the pandemic, people working from home, all of the economic factors, it was an incredibly just unusual set of circumstances that probably gave crypto more attention than it otherwise would have gotten by the mainstream. And the the unfortunate association from that is that a lot of people unwillingly became victims of crypto hacks and scams because they were entering into a space that they really didn't understand. And we see this time and time again where victims of crypto scams, for example, a lot of the cases tragically were entirely avoidable. It was it was falling for the traditional sort of get rich quick schemes. It was not having sort of the basic understandings around what you should or shouldn't do with private keys. And to the audience that has a good crypto knowledge, they'd be astonished if they've seen the statistic as how many people gave away their private keys to scammers, thinking that it was representing an exchange or a customer support function. And then we see the opposite side, where we see the very sophisticated state-sponsored hacks, where we see the attacks or internal thefts in massive exchanges that lead to liquidation events. So I think in 2022, we're probably going to see even more regulatory pressure, and economically, as we've seen the recent sort of couple of weeks and months in the drop in crypto prices around the world, there's also going to be, as the world returns to normal, we're already seeing what happens in fiat will affect crypto. There will be increases. We will have to pay as a global community for all of the various bounce back loans and government support loans and all of the things that happened during the pandemic. So I fully expect that there will be more liquidations. There will be more enforcement action around debt, calling in of personal guarantees that I think will lead to a lot of instability and turmoil over the next 12 months.
Thank you, Aidan. Next, we would like to discuss our maybe Roman, it's a question for you. What are like the main tools, right? Which criminals are using? We're talking about like mixers, you know, different platforms, NFTs, like basically all the tools which are used to, yeah, for the scams and for the money laundering.
Well, so those are kind of the two topics. If it comes to the scams, basically all you can imagine, phishing websites pretending to be real ones. Let's say traditional scams moved to crypto, so fake investments promising a huge return. Also, you know, all kinds of tricks, including social engineering. In many cases, it is based on the quick action time necessary. So you see this ad on YouTube saying send 1 Bitcoin and instantly receive 2 Bitcoins. When people do not understand technology and they want a quick return, and they hear about these huge returns in crypto, they basically don't think twice, and they do that. They send funds, and obviously never get anything in the return. But when it comes to the tools used by hackers, let me also step back here. Why blockchain is so good right now for money laundering? Basically because of all its good features that we actually love, but it is also used by the criminals. So you may create as many private anonymous wallets as you wish, and send the crypto to and fro in between them. To make the transaction is super easy. You don't need the external third party to authorize the transaction. You just do it. And it is done super quickly. So within minutes, you may send value easily from Poland to USA and then to Russia or China. And it's still for the law enforcement, it's still hard to trace, because in most cases then they don't have the expertise and proper tools, because this is a fast-growing industry. We have thousands of developers, and basically every few months the new option for money laundering emerge. Mixers are well known for past years. So this is the situation where you can dissipate the stolen funds in dozens or even thousands of transactions, mix them with the funds from another person that is not related to you. You don't need to believe each other, and this way hide the origination of your funds and this second person. But also there are breaches. So now all these blockchains, there are thousands of blockchains, are connected with each other. I may easily send Bitcoin from Bitcoin blockchain to Ethereum blockchain. Then layer two, so-called layer twos, but also private coins, privacy coins, Monero, Dash, and some others that are now developed, Secret Network, for example. So yeah, that all makes it difficult to trace crypto. But on the other hand, crypto is pseudonymous, so we can see everything what's going on there. So with a proper tool, it's actually easier to trace that in blockchain than in traditional market.
And could you please elaborate a bit more on the privacy coins, right? And then maybe Matt and Aidan, they could they could jump in and see if they encountered this this problem recently.
Yeah, so most famous one is obviously Monero, which is illegal in many countries right now. Monero is created in the way that it's believed to be impossible to properly trace the specific assets, flow of specific assets. So, for example, in Ethereum, in Bitcoin, it's much easier to spot the the flow from A to B and C. And in the privacy coins, the main goal is to actually hide that, to make it impossible. And there are solutions that claim that they can trace through Monero, but this is not. This is based on probability. This is not a proper evidence, especially in court. So that's the big issue, and for the time being, it's not resolved.
Thank you, Roman. Matt, have you encountered problems with privacy coins, and what was your experience in the last year in terms of the tools which you saw been used?
It's interesting. We work in this economy where we observe that some of these threat actors, cyber criminals, prefer Monero to, let's say, Bitcoin. And it goes so far as to, when it reaches us, there are some cyber criminals that will specify the discount that they'll take for receiving Monero in an extortion event instead of Bitcoin. Sometimes that's 10%, 15%, 20, 25%. And it's reflective of the fact that people are starting to understand that Monero is less traceable than Bitcoin, and therefore it comes with less exposure if they're engaged in criminal activities. And so they're willing to put a price on that. It costs them money to launder Bitcoin through mixers. It costs them money to cash out and get fiat currency for that in some way. And by the time they're done paying all the different participants in that illegal economy to turn their Bitcoin into whatever other currency or asset they want from the exchange, there's a cost there, and Monero doesn't carry that cost. And so we watch as there's not a steady trend. There's not a steady trend where we observe that more and more threat actors, cyber criminals, are asking for privacy coins instead of the more traceable blockchain assets. But we do know that there's a subsection of those criminal entities that are aware of the traceability and want to avoid it.
Got it. Thank you. Aidan, anything from your experience recently?
Yeah, I think as an investigator, the way I tend to look at it is that sometimes as an industry, we're spoilt with crypto investigations because, as Roman rightly pointed out, I am often astonished when many criminals use crypto assets because it's so much easier to trace than any other asset. Go buy an expensive Rolex and go buy a piece of art and move that around the world, and it, bar some shipping costs, it is 99% less likely to be traced by anybody. But I think that the thing about privacy coins is also to remember that an investigation does not start and stop with blockchain analytics. We've seen some of the most sophisticated sort of crypto frauds in the world being unraveled because someone's partner or spouse put something online that they shouldn't have, or someone through other wider private investigations has been able to associate people. So I think it's important that it's not just perceived as a sort of one single sort of granular sort of thread in an investigation. There's all of these pieces that come together. And from my perspective, when I see privacy coins, it isn't, for me personally, and this is my own personally held opinion, is that it just confirms you're doing something wrong. In the majority of the cases, that I'm all for respecting privacy, but I think when it comes at a cost, in the same way that no one wants the sort of Big Brother style state monitoring. But I also know that there has to be certain controls in place to stop bad actors who are going to exploit certain things. So if I have to give up a bit of privacy so that there is less likely of someone setting up the next welcome to video site or someone setting up some sort of dark website, I think there's a reasonable societal payoff. So I think that with privacy coins, and criminals don't need to use privacy coins, because the sad reality is that so many government agencies and so many sort of private sector enforcement agencies and civil recovery practitioners aren't up to speed with the conventional tools that many, the traditional sort of big five crypto assets are not being investigated. So actually, it's only a particular breed of criminal that is using sort of privacy coins, because as Matt really sort of expertly summed up, there's a lot of pinch points in that ecosystem for the criminal that they could also lose their own assets, because it's just like the traditional thief taking their gold bar to a fence to someone else to give them money back. They may be ripped off at that point as well. So I think with privacy coins, it's just another sort of complexity in another way, sort of complex setup. But as Roman pointed out, there's other ways of sort of catching people using those assets. It doesn't all rest on the actual privacy coin itself.
Thank you, Aidan. When it comes to the money destination, so where does the illicit money end up? Like from where do you usually find them residing?
And certainly from our point of view, again, I mean, crypto is an asset category in the overall fight in sort of financial crime. So even those that carry out crypto scams, they still want to buy the house, they want to buy the Lambo, they want to buy the Rolex, they want to spend their wealth. These are acquisitive crimes to gain sort of economic advantage. So unless you're a sort of a very particular hacker who just likes disrupting, there's usually a financial motivation to that. So again, that's where the two things sort of pair up nicely, where a blockchain analysis piece would then be coupled with an existing financial investigation. You're looking for those normal off-ramps and that other life litter that sort of criminals will leave. And I think combining the expertise of this new industry against the existing financial crime investigation tools and good old-fashioned detective work really sees some of those brilliant results that have been reported around the world. I think it's a marriage of the two things and looking for those off-ramps into the fiat world.
Got it. Thank you. Matt, same question. Where does the money end up?
Well, that's, as Aidan observes, it's sort of the funny logical conclusion that we don't know once it gets turned into some other asset. We can watch these funds get shuffled around the blockchain until they reach a fiat off-ramp where somebody can turn them into whatever their local currency is, to their Rolex, to their Lambo. Then we stop knowing, where does this transaction go? Are they trading those Rolexes for some other piece of wealth that they're more interested in? You lose track of it. You only get to watch as it goes through the blockchain, and once it gets off one of those off-ramps, you don't know what's happening next. One of the challenges that does happen for us is we watch as the transactions go to exchanges. And those exchanges tend to work the same way that we think of mixers working in the end, because they're the stopping point where you are no longer able to trace the ownership of that asset. Once it goes into a large pooled exchange wallet, you don't have as good an idea of who owns that asset once it comes out the other side, because it may be that they've traded it for another crypto asset on that exchange and you've lost the traceability of those funds to their beneficial owner. That's why we see not just the United States, but other entities taking action specifically against crypto exchanges that are engaged in this transfer of illicit funds, the washing of crypto assets into fiat currencies. That's what we've seen over the last several months here in the United States, with the Treasury Department taking action against a couple of mainly Eastern European cryptocurrency exchanges that service the criminal and fraudulent economy in crypto assets.
That was actually just my next question. Is it seems like a major trend to move the money to exchanges registered in high risk jurisdictions, centralized exchanges, and then and then basically trying to cover up from there. So is there, a way to for these exchanges to be regulated? Because obviously these are no KYC exchanges. What is the trend there from your opinion?
I think we've watched as Bitcoin has become a more and more institutionalized asset class over the last 12 to 24 months. And so more and more people that want to participate in the crypto economy are facing the prospect that they have to do KYC, go through an anti-money laundering check, be identifiable when they touch an asset at an exchange. But like you observe, not every exchange is going to look that way. there are plenty of ways to onboard people without checking their passport, their driver's license, their proof of address, all of the rest of the things that one does when you try to identify someone. And so there will be these sort of islands of illicit activity that don't require people to register, that allow them to stay anonymous. And so how far can a regime like the FATF or like OFAC extend to those places? I think we're going to see an examination of that over the next few years, because that's really the frontier for regulating these things.
Yeah, and then so during your investigation, like, do those exchanges and or any other kind of platforms, do they are they willing to help the investigation? Do you contact them for any kind of info? I mean, can they provide any info for you?
I think Aidan knows a lot more about this, but we observed that the better a place for a criminal to go to dump their crypto into fiat, the less willing that place is to cooperate. There are some exchanges that cooperate at a very high level. And we've seen, for instance, the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack that happened last year and was a big source of headlines about crypto assets, seizures, ransomware, cybercrime. The place that those funds that were recovered got seized was a United States cryptocurrency exchange, who I'm sure was watching their transactions, was in touch with law enforcement in the United States, perhaps also internationally, and able to observe that these funds were tied to that attack. It's not as sophisticated elsewhere. We see a lot of funds going to places that are less regulated, like you observed, Malta-based exchanges, elsewhere, that we know aren't watching as carefully, and the cyber criminals know are not watching as carefully. And so it's a self-selecting process, widely speaking.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
Aidan?
Well, just to add to that, Matt summed it up very well. I think that we need to also be realistic. I think where there's a risk of us almost expecting too much from the industry and the sector, and I mean that in the nicest possible way, because I think the crypto sector has done an incredible amount. When you consider how young this industry is, I could very easily be the sort of stereotypical sort of ex-criminal investigator from the public sector and think that all crypto is bad and join that sort of parade of public sector officials who have called it the wild west. And we've seen the huge 180s carried out by lots of sort of financial centers around the world about crypto. I mean, we have all of these challenges in the regular world, in the non-crypto world. So even if we get 90% of exchanges being ultra complicit or ultra compliant, and Matt is right, I mean, the exchanges we deal with on a daily basis, the vast majority have law enforcement liaison. They have really good guys and girls who will go the extra mile and really help victims of fraud as much as the banks do. And I think that we will never root it out. Even if we have ultra tight regulations all around the world, there will always be those for financial gain will offer those services in exactly the same way. I can buy a Rolex for $100,000 in cash in certain places, and I can buy gold and art in certain places, and I'll pay a premium for those services. So I think it'll be unrealistic to think that we'll ever stamp it out. But I think that as the industry continues to grow and evolve, those on and off ramps we talked about, if people want to introduce their wealth, for example, and they want to buy a property, well, then the bank will want to see the history. And if you've been using an exchange that no one has heard of and it's not on an approved list, you'll not be able to enter the traditional ecosystem. So I think lots of regulatory changes will sort of herd things a little bit better and bring people into line, that we will just, as consumers, choose to use certain services over others. And then it becomes quite clear, if you're using this service, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of show me the legitimate use for a mixer. I haven't seen one yet. So we know that we can draw that inference. And I think a lot of exchanges will end up in that category in exactly the same way. There's company formation agents and offshore tax havens that every investigator knows if you go there, there's a particular reason why you're using that particular functionality. So they're not crypto challenges. And if the fiat world hasn't sorted it out in a century, it's unrealistic to think that we're going to sort of fix things in crypto. I think that the progress already made over the last 3 or 4 years is astonishing, and the industry should be applauded for it.
Thank you, Aidan. So as we move into the wrapping up of this section, Roman, could you Yeah, could you list like some of the red flags which are which are obvious for the when you see the money laundering process? Like what are the main red flags you usually see?
So I would say the best red flag would be a high risk score on Coinfirm IML platform because we check like hundreds of indicators for the transaction, for the address, and both from the indicators that are originated both from the traditional financial system, so the ones that banks are using for fiat transfers, but also specific indicators specific for blockchain. And you really need to look at this from the broader perspective. To give you the example, one indicator would be the address is receiving assets and instantly sending them further. So what's the point of that if the asset is just used for automatically receiving and sending it further and further and further? But also, addresses that constantly receive and send assets further are so-called hot wallets of crypto exchanges. So you would need to combine, the ownership data, the behavior of the address, and in that way create the risk behind the address. What could be other indicators? Well, basically, when in most cases, when the crypto is stolen, hacker perpetrator is creating so-called layering scheme. So assets are not sent within one transaction, but rather dissipated into many addresses. As I mentioned before, you may create as many addresses as you wish, then the assets are sent to and fro, mixed with assets from other sources. External mixers may be used, but also hacker can create a bot that would make the automate the transactions. Many cases include also bridges, but obviously this may be also legitimate transactions. So yeah, you need this broader look at the topic. What we're doing at Coinfirm, for example, is we combining these indicators that I mentioned, and with the knowledge, because as we said already a few times, in blockchain we see everything what's going on. So we may move from the probability approach from traditional financial system to the certainty approach that is only possible in blockchain. How are we doing that? Well, if I know that the address is related to fraudster, then using a special tracking algorithm, we may propagate the risk. So it doesn't matter that address dissipates the stolen funds, send them to thousands of addresses in hundreds of thousand transactions. The algorithm would propagate the risk, and each address would be flagged as related to the crime. And then institution or VASP or crypto service that's using IML solution may be notified immediately once the stolen or fraudulent assets reach the crypto service.
Thank you, Roman. We're going to move now to the next section, which is ransomware, and I'll ask Matt to start with this. So if you can just give us the specific of ransomware in crypto.
Sure. Let's talk about a brief overview of how a ransomware attack might happen. There is a vast economy out there of auction and buy and sell sites where someone can go and get stolen credentials. That's one way that cyber criminals penetrate a company or an individual's network. They can also brute force or by means of an email or spear phishing attack get someone to put a piece of malware onto their computer, onto their network, and gain access to the files on a server, in a corporate network, on an IT system. They then load ransomware software into that network. That software encrypts those files so that only someone with the password can unlock them. We see that happen to businesses every day here in the United States and around the world. And it is, in some cases, a minor speed bump along their path to getting back to business because they have good backups and can reload from their offline systems and get right back to business. In other situations, they're simply unable to operate. We've seen situations where hospitals and schools have to go to pen and paper for days or weeks instead of using their patient or student tracking systems. We've seen situations where companies that have large IoT installations lose access to their factories, their production lines, their monitoring systems, and can't do anything that their business is expected to do. People lose access to payroll systems, so they can't get their employees paid. They lose access to their benefit connections. It becomes a very difficult problem depending on how prepared people are to defend against and recover from these attacks. And when you observe how much harm is done to these businesses in situations where they are unprepared, or even where they are prepared and the ransomware has just been a novel enough attack that it gets them out of their core business anyways, locks up their systems in a way that is still extremely harmful to them, it becomes easier to relate to why are these companies making these payments. And cyber criminals know this. They are doing extensive research on the companies that they perpetrate these attacks against to figure out what their willingness to pay might be. And so they've built up a really intricate, decentralized system for extorting these companies. You get hit by a ransomware attack, you walk in one Monday morning and your systems don't work. There is an electronic note sitting on your server or on your desktop PC saying, come contact me, come to this Tor site where the IP address is untraceable, the source of the attack is untraceable, but they are able to interact with you through a chat window. They have negotiators, some of them working 24 hours a day to make sure that they can service your questions about what happened to me. Am I sure that I can get my files decrypted? Will you show me proof that if I give you a file, you can decrypt it? How much is this going to cost? What do you want? Will you promise not to do this again? Will you give me a report on how you got into my systems? They are prepared for all of those questions because they've been at this for a while and they have an excellent customer service system to back up the attack and get what they want, which is the money for having perpetrated the attack. So we watch as companies try to assess the damage that's been done, try to understand if there is economic value in paying for their files to be unlocked, their data to be deleted so that it's not auctioned off on the dark web, so that they don't have to deal with the responsibility that they then have to their customers' data to report it, to make sure that it's secure. And some do make the decision to pay these threat actors, and it is always only in cryptocurrency. And so then the companies again face a decision of, is this legal? How do I report this to law enforcement? How do I get this cryptocurrency? How do I do this in a way that's secure so that the cryptocurrency doesn't get stolen from me too? All sorts of different decisions come up when you're experiencing one of these attacks, and none of them are easy, and they're all disturbing because you know that in some situations, the best thing that you can do is pay a criminal to make it stop. The cryptocurrency for the business that's been affected in some ways tends to be the easy part. But the challenge is, how do we help law enforcement make it so these attacks stop? How do we help businesses understand what their options are when it comes to sending cryptocurrency, tracing cryptocurrency, perhaps recovering that cryptocurrency if it lands at a place where it's identifiable, freezable, traceable, and recoverable. And so it's, in a microcosm, it covers every part of what, say, Aiden does on a broader set of assets, a broader set of recovery questions, because you get to watch as the money gets laundered. You get to watch as law enforcement operates in the background to see if they can contribute to preventing or to seizing assets related to these attacks. And then who else are the participants in this ecosystem? Who are the exchanges that end up being involved? Who are the people that end up turning that cryptocurrency into fiat assets, into hard assets that the criminals can use in other operations? It's really an interesting case study, and it's also a really challenging part of being in business and being on the internet today.
Thank you, Matt. Moving to Aiden. So my question is about, so because, Aiden, you operate in the UK, Matt in the US. So let's start with Aiden. Like, what are the government and law enforcement initiatives which are actually affecting and helping you, to combat money laundering, ransomware, and so on?
I think that, and it's been a question that has been raised in the Q&A around, is ransomware tax deductible? And it may be, and this is something, I'm a former criminal tax investigator, and it was always, and again, I always sort of try and parallel this against other comparable activity. So the debate about whether or not ransomware is tax deductible, for example, in my personal opinion, I think that would be a mistake, simply because it would be very, very difficult to separate when someone is fraudulently staging a ransomware attack and again, this isn't a crypto issue. This has been debated since the mafia extorted businesses, since the paramilitaries across the world made businesses pay protection money. It has been a long-running grey issue. And I think that what governments and law enforcement and regulators are doing very well is trying to not reinvent the wheel. Like, there is no specific crypto law enforcement legislation. It's a complex asset. There's no specific crypto investigation legislation. And from an enforcement perspective, there's of course little tweaks and modifications made, but fundamentally how you approach it no different than someone who's had diamonds seized or had any other assets seized. So that for me is a reassuring part. I think that what we're seeing, and we mentioned earlier on, is by shutting down the very obvious loopholes and criminalizing the activity that is blatantly illegal, I think they are the things that could be done quicker. And I think the ROI is there to justify increased action. I still think that crypto is somewhat set on a shelf in many countries, and there's still these, in my own opinion, sort of somewhat ridiculous debates taking place around banning or not banning. If you ban narcotics, you still need to have detection capabilities, investigation capabilities. You still need all of the same tools. So it's a bit of a moot point for me personally as an investigator, whether or not what someone's opinion is on it. So I think the UK, and we deal with these cases globally. And I think those countries that have done the best are those that are looking at it as they approach other crime types. So when we talk about ransomware, for example, and Asset Reality, we regularly work with kidnap experts, people who are used to negotiating in that sense, people who have spent 30 years as career detectives in assisting overseas countries when a oil rig worker has been kidnapped, for example, in Nigeria. The process and exactly what Matt listed, what happens to the funds when you pay it across? Are they going to be robbed? What provisions and security can you put in place when you're paying it? So I think governments can continue to look to the other crime types that they do well and deal with well and apply that to crypto, rather than thinking this is a unique and special thing we need to deal differently. It has nuances, but fundamentally, I think applying the same blueprints that already work is the best way forward.
Thank you. Matt, anything to add on the US side, like how it's happening there?
Well, we watched this summer and fall as every law enforcement stakeholder in the United States went in front of congressional hearings for our Department of Homeland Security and other places that consider what does the ransomware outbreak mean for our national security. And we watched as the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and our Secret Service and other law enforcement agencies all stood up in those testimonies and were asked, should we ban cryptocurrency? Should we ban ransomware payments? Should we ban cyber insurance, which is one of the main catalysts for the decision to pay because it becomes less costly in the eyes of a company that's making that decision? And every one of those entities said, no, none of that is going to actually help stop this. It'll drive it elsewhere. Like Aidan says, you still have to have a strategy for interdicting drug transfers, even if you're going to ban narcotics. Similarly, in the ransomware space, you have to have a strategy for stopping these attacks. And the only way that any of us know for stopping that is through law enforcement, is through the cooperation between the people who are paying these things, the people that are transferring the funds across blockchains, the people that are turning those funds from blockchain assets into fiat assets. You need those people to stand up and describe what they're doing. Reporting is what every law enforcement agency in the United States wants to see when it comes to not just ransomware, but any kind of crypto asset assisted cybercrime. They want to know what's going on so that they can figure out how to do their job and do the law enforcement that goes along with preventing it.
Got it. Thank you, Matt. Let's move to the asset recovery now. Like, also important topic. Aidan, could you guide us through the what are the possibilities of asset recovery in crypto, and wherever it's what people should expect, like just not to expect too much of it, or like what are the abilities of the asset recovery?
Yeah, so I genuinely, I'm very bullish and confident on crypto asset recovery simply because of the fantastic tools that have been developed all around the world in terms of the initial detection, the analysis. And again, we have a really good track record as a global community in asset recovery when all things line up well. Now, you could, on one side, you could argue that global asset recovery before crypto, some of the statistics from places like Europol were only 2% of criminals' assets are ever seized. So you've already got a shaky system, and then you put something like crypto on top of it. But I personally believe that some of the exceptional results that we've seen globally, crypto asset recovery has recovered more value in some countries like the US and the UK than all other categories of assets and all agencies combined. I mean, a US example is the IRS. Criminal investigation has recovered $3.5 billion in crypto assets. That figure, when you set it against the 2.6 or 2.7 billion that was returned by the US Marshals for all categories of assets across multiple departments, and it's repeated in the UK, £300 million worth of crypto has been seized. 250 million is the total figure for all assets. So I think there's a bit of a crypto gold rush in terms of opportunities, which is a good thing for victims. It's a good thing for funding law enforcement. And crypto asset recovery for me is that very virtuous cycle that if governments really want to tackle it, it's like Matt's earlier point about Senate committees, and we wouldn't suggest banning cash because we have money laundering or shutting banks because people commit frauds. I think it's an immature approach to what is otherwise a very good technology that can add a lot of value. I think it's people who don't understand it are coming up with sort of knee-jerk reactions to the tools. And I think when you understand that crypto asset recovery has a really clear sort of chronology to follow, move quickly, use the tools, public and private sector collaboration, and doing, as Matt said, dealing with the reports in non-crypto asset recovery, in normal asset recovery and economic crime. Governments around the world regularly report that suspicious activity reports and suspicious transaction reports are submitted in their hundreds of thousands, but law enforcement is not given the budgets to accurately deal with it. It's a big data problem. You've got all of these suspicious reports coming in from the financial services sector that are not actioned because law enforcement doesn't have the resource to process and deal with it. And my worry is we're going to head the same way with crypto. We're going to have lots of regulation that tells people to submit reports, but we're not going to have people on the other side of the fence to deal with those reports. And they could be really interesting crypto asset recovery opportunities. If someone puts in a report and says Matt has £1 million with a Bitcoin sitting in an exchange and the tools have flagged that to be really suspicious, well then if someone acts quickly, someone can get a freezing order, can seize those assets, and all of a sudden reverse work backwards and find out and actually identify the victims of that scam. So I think with crypto, there's such a positive opportunity for recoveries that it would be a great shame if we didn't apply it. And crypto asset recovery, from my perspective, is very straightforward. I can carry out an entire seizure, investigation, and detection from a desktop. It doesn't require the same resources that recovering a yacht or a vehicle require. So I hope that with the art of the possible and government seeing the potential, we'll see lots more crypto asset recovery taking place. But it comes with that initial investment, and training and education and awareness needs to happen to shake off a lot of the cliched views held in many countries around crypto assets.
Thank you, Aidan. So we are moving towards now the end of the webinar. So we're gonna jump to the questions from the audience, and yeah, so please feel free to answer if you have anything to add. So first question is about the OFAC's sanction list. Like the question is wherever it's too lenient and wherever more entities should be listed there. Like anything to add on this?
I think
that's more your field than mine.
It certainly is, and it dovetails right behind the conversation we were just having, which is how does any government entity, let's call it OFAC, which is part of the Department of Treasury here in the United States, how do any of these entities confront this problem that this is knowable in many situations? If enough eyes are on the problem and enough conviction is behind the effort, we can locate a lot of these funds. These funds can be tracked and seized and stopped. The criminal entities that are behind them interdicted, shut down. There's another question in the Q&A talking about last week we watched videos of people in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, elsewhere in Russia being arrested by Russian authorities for being part of the REvil ransomware group. And they were digging out piles of cash from desk drawers, crypto wallets that they were seizing, and I don't know who gives them the password or the private keys to those things so that they can get the funds and return them to their rightful owners, but it happens. We watch right down to the very last mile of some of these law enforcement efforts resulting in seizures, resulting in arrests. And then the question is, how many of these entities can OFAC enforce against? Can they put every bad guy that they think might be related to these incidents onto the sanctions list? I don't know. I suspect that they're answering that question themselves. And I always check my email every morning, go to the Treasury's website to see if they take in new enforcement actions, because we, sitting sort of at the center of some of these transactions, expect it on a daily basis. And especially now that there are 100,000 Russian troops sitting on the border of the Ukraine, we're expecting more and more financial sanctions to come from OFAC that touch crypto assets. Can you send crypto assets to someone in Crimea? It certainly appears that as a United States citizen, the answer is either no, or you better be very careful if the answer is yes. And so will that extend to other places in Russia, in Ukraine, in the rest of Eastern Europe? I think OFAC is thinking about how far that they can push that perimeter, how far they can extend the sanctions list to crypto wallets, individuals, places that handle cryptocurrency transactions. And I think we'll see the answer to that question in short order.
Thank you, Matt.
If it comes to sanction list, in 2020, I was working on the report. And basically, the goal was to see where the funds, where the crypto assets goes from the addresses listed on the sanction list as related to terrorism financing. And what was astonished for me is that when we took those addresses from the list, within a few hours, we've been able to identify that the list should be broader by 10 or 20 or 50 times. Using simple analysis, simple blockchain analysis, we've been able to say basically that the owner of this Bitcoin address is also the owner of additional 20 Bitcoin addresses, and his crypto wealth is much bigger. And all those addresses should be there on the list, and they weren't. Also, a regulator forgot about so-called forks. So when Bitcoin Cash was created, basically the owner of Bitcoins also received, out of nowhere, received Bitcoin Cash, but those addresses were not considered. This is again huge advantage of blockchain, how simple analysis can provide much more details behind the perpetrator, but you just need a proper tool and a proper experience.
Thank you, Roman. So next question from Mason Tabarsa is actually logical continuation to this. So he's asking if tracing cryptocurrencies should be like just government legislation, or it should also do with computer science, or it should be a mix of both.
I definitely think that's a mix, and it may be more of a statement than a question. I would agree with Mason that we already have the legislation in governments all around the world. There's a misconception that governments need to. I often hear in my sort of lecturing capacity that countries they're sorting out their legislation around crypto, then they'll look at it. Your money laundering legislation covers all crypto activity anyway. If a criminal does something and they have a piece of art and a Bitcoin, you don't need Bitcoin legislation to seize it. It's a store of value. It's just a realizable asset. And most government definitions of property covers tangible and intangible, way back from sort of when the internet was first introduced and when people hold stocks or shares. So I personally haven't come across a piece of legislation in the world that doesn't cover intangible assets. So you could argue that actually all governments have the tools already, what they need to do it at scale and do it effectively. And I'm not going to say I'm not a fan of sanctions lists, but I'm not convinced on their sort of effectiveness, because we've seen blatant sanctions evasions in the art market, for example. Because again, I think with crypto and blockchain related analysis, the possibilities are so much better. And as Roman rightly pointed out, if you use it to its full advantage and you start to list and cluster, and it's much more dynamic, and I think the opportunities are there. But I think it is a combination of a political desire and will to want to sort of go after these things, give people the tools. I regularly hear people talk about, we don't have the budget for this, but there's budgets being spent on other areas of computer forensic activity, and governments have massive budgets to do lots of things. If there is a political will to direct that to crypto investigations, it can be achieved.
Thank you, Aidan. Okay, we have time for one more question, and there is a big question from Uri Martin. I'm going to break it down. So, do you believe that with the appearance of CBDCs, paper money will eventually disappear? And then the second part of the question is, what impact would that have on the security of central banks, and wherever this will decrease the traditional black market?
I want to take this one.
Sure.
We've asked this question a lot of times, both in our business and externally, about cryptocurrency in general. And I don't know the answer, but we watch as India kind of skips past the credit card phase of an economy to go straight from cash, which they now ban in a lot of situations, to what are essentially digital currencies, right? Having a bank account that only moves funds online is not specifically distinct from a CDBC. Is that part of a trend? Is cash so important to human society that we'll never get rid of it? I don't think any of us really know. We live in this present where it seems that way, but it's also very easy to imagine that everyone could get pushed into a no cash economy. And that creates a situation where, Aidan, you were talking earlier about how you've never seen a legitimate use case for a mixer. And sitting here in the United States, neither have I, but then we watched years ago as a number of royals in the Saudi family got basically imprisoned in the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh. And you wonder if those people would have more liberty if they were able to move crypto assets instead of their art, cars, gold, and cash. See the same thing in a place like Hong Kong, where there are many people who are considering whether they have enough economic freedom in that place. And the ability to obscure their transactions on a blockchain might be fundamental in the future to whether they really do have the kind of property rights that we sit and are entitled to in Western Europe, in the United Kingdom, in the United States. And so this is a frontier of where do property rights rest with people who want to participate in an economy. And I don't think we know the answer. And I think we're going to see societies test the relative benefits of high freedom and more control over the next few decades. I think that it's an important question, but I don't think any of us know the answer.
Thank you, Matt. All right. Actually, no, let's squeeze one more question. What do you, Olga T is asking, what do you think about the FATF travel rule in terms of information sharing among VASPs?
I'll certainly give a brief. I'll maybe see if Roman wants to add to this, but I think that again, set it against the main intention. The intention is not to make things difficult for developers in virtual asset service providers, or to make it difficult and stifle sort of companies building up for the first time. We're a fintech startup. We understand that there's going to be challenges, and there's often criticisms of FATF around travel rules saying that it's stifling innovation. And if I'm trying to be objective about it, I think that the intention in all of this is not to stifle innovation. It's because it's possible. It's not as easy or as possible in the traditional banking sectors. So I think it's the cliches, with great power becomes great responsibility, because there are opportunities to ask more questions and find out more about these assets and keep people safer and remove money laundering to a greater extent than in the existing fiat. There will always be that added pressure. But I think what the industry is very good at doing is grouping together and presenting really good sort of reports and feeding back as part of these focus groups and consultation groups. The FCA is running one in the UK right now, for example. And people do have a forum to push back and say, look, we understand why you're asking for this, but literally companies can't operate if you make them too draconian. So I would sit on the side of government and FATF when I would say that I understand the motivation behind doing it, but I would defer to Matt or Roman to comment more on the complexities that presents for a sort of technology company in compliance, because that wouldn't be my field.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much, Aidan. Right. I think we have to wrap up now. Thank you so much for joining us today, like sharing your knowledge. It was an amazing discussion. Thank you for tuning in. The webinar would be recorded, so we're gonna share it later. Yeah, I mean, this was the first part of our series on the crypto crime investigation. And yeah, thank you so much for attending, and we'll keep you posted on our next webinars. Roman, Aidan, Matthew, thank you so much.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.